Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our public engagement session for the Draft Streets Manual and Interactive Streets Map. This is an opportunity for city staff to hear from you. But before we get started, I wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping items. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded so that we can post it to the city's website following the meeting. Following a brief presentation, we will move into a period for questions and answers. We will be collecting questions and comments directly in the chat window, and you can feel free to submit your questions at any time, including during the presentation. Following the presentation, I will direct those questions to the panel for responses and discussion. You can see on your screen some steps to get you to the chat window, both on your computer and on your phone, in case you can't locate it. We will answer as many questions as we can live, but anything that we are unable to answer due to time limitations will be posted on the city website on the Strategic Mobility Plan page. If you're not familiar, the Strategic Mobility Plan is our long-range vision and policy document, and we are currently hosting our other planning efforts on that page as well. And the website is charlottenc.gov/SMP. For today's discussion, our panelists are going to provide an overview of the Streets Manual, explain the key changes from Draft 1 to Draft 2, and then we'll lay out next steps and further engagement opportunities, and then we'll finish with questions and answers. With that, I would like to introduce our panel. We have Tracy Newsom, Transportation Planner with the Strategic Mobility Division of CDOT, David Harrison, also Transportation Planner with the Strategic Mobility Division, Ed McKinney, Deputy Director of CDOT, and myself, I'm the Section Manager for the Strategic Mobility Division of CDOT. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ed McKinney to provide an overview of the Streets Manual and how it relates to other planning efforts going on in the city.
Thank you, Julian. Again, this is Ed McKinney with CDOT, and maybe if you go to the next slide, what I like to do is just provide a little bit of context of how this work fits into our larger vision. And so I think many would know that last year, about a year ago, the city adopted the 2040 comprehensive plan, and that essentially set the vision for our growth citywide. What we've been doing since then is a series of really key important initiatives to help implement that plan. As you see on this slide, the 2040 policy map, which was the land use component of the 2040 comprehensive plan, which just got adopted this past spring. The Unified Development Ordinance, which is sort of the rules and regulations around how we plan and accommodate growth, is a major initiative that's underway now and with the intent of getting adopted later this summer. In the middle is the Strategic Mobility Plan, and that's the component of this growth vision that talks about our transportation investment, the mobility vision for how we accommodate that growth. And so there's a policy document that actually just got adopted last night that sets that vision for the city growth that helps implement the 2040 comprehensive plan. What we want to talk about today is the Streets Manual, and that's a sort of a key technical component of this work that helps make the connection between the 2040 policy map and the Unified Development Ordinance. And so there's some key guidelines and components of that we're going to talk through today that help, again, implement that vision in a more specific way. And so what I'll do now is turn it back over to the team to talk about the specifics of the Streets Manual.
Thank you, Ed. So first and foremost, what is the Streets Manual? The first component of the Streets Manual is the Streets Map, which is a digital and interactive map along with separate supporting technical documentation and a policy foundation. The Streets Map defines a set of street types and describes a future multimodal cross-section for each arterial street throughout the city. As our city continues to grow and sees both public and private mobility investment, this ensures we are protecting for the right-of-way and space needed to create a safe and equitable street network. While this draft is a citywide streets map, City Council actually previously has adopted a version that's around the Blue Line light rail stations. This occurred in 2019 that was happened alongside the Transit-Oriented Development, or TOD ordinance. So this applies that same approach citywide in support of the upcoming Unified Development Ordinance, or UDO, and will be adopted in the same timeline as that process. In addition to the streets map, there is a set of guidance called the Access Management and Driveway Design. This is a set of technical guidelines that we use today that speaks to driveway spacing and site access. So we are incorporating those existing guidelines into the streets manual. The third piece of the streets manual is the Comprehensive Transportation Review, or CTR. The CTR is a modernization of our traffic impact review guidelines that the city uses in the land development process. The CTR describes a new approach on multimodal assessment of land development review and includes transportation demand management, or TDM, strategies that talk about getting less vehicle trips on the road, and an update to how we do traffic impact studies that will go into more detail here in a few slides. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to describe in more detail the streets map. So why is the streets map important? It establishes our multimodal vision for our streets and reflects adopted transportation policies to inform how our streets should look and function moving forward. It also ensures we protect the needed right-of-way and are planning long-term for the right amount of space needed for that safe and equitable mobility network. There's also a specific connection to the UDO that ensures a set of design and development standards are required by the ordinance. This slide describes the set of street types that have been applied comprehensively to the arterial street network. These definitions aren't new and were established by the adopted Urban Street Design Guidelines, or USDG, back in 2007. They each have a specific set of design and dimensional expectations that we'll go into next. One piece with the second draft streets map is the inclusion of uptown streets with their own set of classifications. Again, this approach isn't entirely new and is based on a previously adopted Center City Transportation Plan. And there is also a connection to the latest draft of the UDO. Here is some detail about what is in the streets map and what comprises the dimensional requirements of each multimodal cross-section. In addition to those street classifications, there was a determination made on what is the future number of travel lanes needed to protect for vehicular capacity improvements in certain corridors. Rooted in our bicycle policies is also a recommendation of bicycle facility type with specific dimensions for each corridor. And our pedestrian plans and policies also provide guidance on appropriate sidewalk and streetscape dimensions, such as planting strip and amenity zone. So combining these details from adopted plans and applying them to each segment of each arterial arrives at a specific dimension needed to protect the right-of-way to implement our mobility policies. This is the first time we've been able to comprehensively combine these various adopted policies in such a clear and consistent way. This is a snapshot of the online streets map, which we'll provide a link to. This draft map was released last fall and conducted public engagement alongside the Planning Department's policy map. Working through public comment and some technical revisions, we've arrived at a second draft and are collecting public comments until June 30th. What this slide shows is just one example of the detail provided for each arterial street. The classification, number of travel lanes, and bicycle and pedestrian facilities are all clearly defined, as well as a future back of curb location, which has a specific importance related to the UDO that we'll go into next. These next two slides demonstrate how the streets map relates to the Unified Development Ordinance. This is an example from South Boulevard, a mixed-use corridor adjacent to Blue Line light rail stations that has seen a lot of development activity in recent years. The policy map tells us what type of place or level of intensity and potential zoning could occur here. In this case, a regional activity center. This is a transit-oriented development urban center, or TODUC zoning district, one of the more intense development districts. The streets map then tells us specifically what we need to protect for along this corridor, such as on-street parking in this case, a buffered bike lane, the 4 travel lanes that exist today, and an expectation for consistent center turn lane to be achieved as development occurs. You can see there's also the required planting strip, amenity zone, and sidewalk dimensions listed. This level of specificity allows us to protect for the needed space as corridors develop incrementally. And then the UDO has a set of standards such as setback and building articulation that is based on the type of street and zoning district. So this describes at a high level how it all works together and how our mobility policies and the streets map work in concert with the UDO to implement the vision of how we see our streets evolving as land development occurs over time. I mentioned with this second draft, based on public comment and technical revisions, we made several key changes from the first draft to the second draft. On the S&P website, there was a link with detailed specific changes. That's a snapshot on the left, what that link will look like. The second draft streets map changes document provides a level of detail of every change made. But at a high level, we categorized some of the changes into a refinement of our collector street network based on land use context and ordinance criteria. As previously mentioned, we added uptown street types and their on-street parking information that is based on the Center City Transportation Plan. And in several spot locations, we made refinements or technical corrections to either the bicycle pedestrian facility classification or future street extents based on a closer look at existing conditions. In addition, on the streets manual component, we provided details about how the streets map can be amended, including modifications that can be approved by the CDOT director. So this is a highlight of the changes. The technical revisions are available on the website as well. And now I'll pass it to Tracy to discuss more detail the access management and driveway design.
Okay, sorry about that. I'd like to apologize for the lighting. I'm not sitting in a cave. Thanks, David. Again, I'm Tracy Newsom. I'm with CDOT. And David's done a really good overview of the first component of the streets manual, which is the streets map. I'm going to spend a little bit of time giving some information about the other two components of the streets manual, the access management and driveway design guidance and the comprehensive transportation review guidance. I think one of the key points to make about the access management and driveway design guidance is it is not really substantively different from the process that we use today through our driveway manual that we currently have. It is, however, has been reorganized, reformatted for clarity and for ease of use, because it's really an important technical document to help guide the decisions that are made through the UDO, for example. It's important because it provides for safe and equitable access to streets. The number of driveways, where they're located, how they're located, their design is important for really setting the edge and managing the edge of the public right-of-way, where the public realm comes in contact with the street. With the private realm, excuse me. It does provide consistent, predictable guidance on the type of access to streets, and some elements of this are specifically incorporated into the UDO. And it provides also as well guidance on appropriate driveway designs to use in different contexts and mitigation requirements, like whether or not a turn lane might be required. Again, in terms of changes between the first draft and the second draft, it's basically a reorganization, a restructuring, and just really an attempt to provide as clear and useful guidance as we can, but not substantively different. So if the access management and driveway design guidance was not substantively different from how we currently do things, here is something that is significantly different or substantively different, and that's our comprehensive transportation review guidelines, the third component of the streets manual. This is basically a modernization, I think David already said, a modernization of our current approach to evaluating the impacts of development on our transportation system and how those impacts should be mitigated through infrastructure investment. The CTR will essentially, these guidelines will replace the city's current traffic impact study guidelines. We are proposing through this to reduce the trip thresholds, those triggers that determine whether or not a development needs to provide a traffic impact study. And importantly, we're incorporating new multimodal assessments. We're incorporating new multimodal assessments that allow us to take a more context-based look at the development impacts that are occurring and the mitigations for them. A key important reason for having the CTR is that the UDO is ultimately going to rezone Charlotte. And so currently what happens is that our traffic impact study guidelines are typically used through a conditional rezoning process. With the UDO, we will have more by right development. We need to make sure that this development management tool that we have actually works in that by right future world. So the call to modernize our current traffic impact study process is tied directly to the 2040 plan policy. And I think it's helpful if we're trying to explain what it is that's different. Let's look at what we're doing today and kind of do a quick comparison. So today in our traffic impact study process, we're focused almost entirely on vehicle trip impacts. We measure the number of trips that a development will generate. We analyze how that will impact streets and nearby intersections. And the study will define certain investments, infrastructure improvements that would be expected. Under the current process that is really focused on motor vehicles and those types of mitigations. The CTR will expand that to be more multimodal in the assessment. Our current process has one threshold of 2,500 trips to trigger the need to actually do a traffic study. That's kind of a one size fits all approach. That threshold is considered to be fairly high compared to some other peer cities and local municipalities. So the CTR actually introduced a tiered approach and a context-based approach to thresholds. The current process, traffic impact study process, is applied primarily in the conditional rezoning process. And as I already mentioned, as we go more into a by right world, we're going to need guidelines that are able to allow us to appropriately assess transportation impacts and investments to mitigate for them. So how do we get there? And the there that we're trying to get to is the vision of the 2040 plan. So how do we use the CTR, and how does the CTR allow us to get to that vision? And before I kind of walk through these three steps and these three questions, I want to point out that one of the things that the CTR does very explicitly is to try to take a context-based approach to how these transportation impacts are assessed and mitigated. And it does that by actually defining high intensity versus low intensity places. And the idea there is that the things that would be important to solve for in a high intensity place may be a little bit different, or there's more nuance there than in a low intensity place. And so specifically within the CTR, these assessments that are done are based on the UDO zoning districts and whether or not they're considered high intensity or low intensity. So again, context is built into the process. And so there are three questions that we would want development to answer, whereas in the past we might have had one question we wanted them to answer. Now we have three questions and we have three types of assessments based on context, based on the scale of development, based on where you are. You may do all of these assessments or not. So the first question is, how are we moving people? And that's a key point. It's about moving people, not just moving traffic or cars. And there's a simple multimodal assessment that's done whether you're in a high intensity or low intensity, assuming you trigger it. And what that is about basically identifying pedestrian needs in the vicinity that would have an immediate impact. We know, for example, where there might be sidewalk gaps or where there's accessibility ramps that are not accessible the way they should be. Or in some cases, it could be a pedestrian crossing on. So for example, the example that David gave of South Boulevard, there might be a need for a pedestrian crossing, an identified need. So that's the first level of assessment. The second level of assessment in the CTR is transportation demand management level plan. That applies only in the higher intensity and the transit supportive places, because those are the places where we're looking for an opportunity to take advantage of the mix of uses, the fact that there's good transit service, and the high intensity and high density locations to actually provide strategies and employ strategies that will encourage people to choose not to use a single occupant vehicle. So it's about reducing the number of trips made in a single occupant vehicle. And so those strategies can be things like, offering transit passes, having on-site bike and shower end of trip facilities that help people make the choice not to either come to that place or to move around in that place by a single occupant vehicle. And again, that's applied in the higher intensity places. And then finally, we know we can't not look at traffic. We've got 300 square miles, over 300 square miles of a city with a lot of different contexts. And the whole point of this is to make sure that we're, using the appropriate tools to evaluate and to mitigate. And so we still would have a traffic impact study if you trigger that study. The thresholds for that have been revised, and they do vary based on whether you're in a high intensity or low intensity place. They are generally a little bit lower than the current threshold. And that's in part because we know that we're moving to a by right situation where we might have many types of developments that we need to at least look at the transportation impacts. Just a quick example, kind of an illustrative example of how these three different questions and three different assessments might be applied. So in this example, this is on East Moorhead, close to Uptown, an office building with some retail on the ground floor. So it's a little bit of a mixed use environment. From a place type perspective on the policy map, this would be likely a regional activity center. And then from the UDO zoning perspective, and again, the CTR ties to these zoning districts, this might fall into the urban edge because it is right at the edge of Uptown. And so when you look at kind of at how the CTR might be applied in this environment, the first multimodal assessment says, how are we moving people? So yes, in this case, this development would do a multimodal assessment. And in this case, again, we're looking at known pedestrian needs in the area. In this case, there would be the ability to fund or construct a planned signal at Caldwell and Moorhead, which provides for safer and more convenient pedestrian crossing. So it's explicitly a multimodal improvement there. Secondly, this would likely trigger, and I'm not speaking specifically to this project, but given its proximity to the blue line, given its location relative to high intensity places, it would trigger a TDM assessment. And in that case, property manager would implement a TDM plan, likely to, again, do things like provide for transit passes, provide on-site facilities for end of trip if you bike or walk to work, for example. And then finally, and this really is about kind of really defining the difference between the way the CTR would work and the way the traffic impact study works, is that if the focus is on multimodal and TDM, because this is a high intensity urban location, this would not have triggered under the CTR a traffic impact study the way a project located in a different location, maybe of a different size, might have. And so that's just intended to be a quick illustrative example of how these three different types of assessments work together based on context and scale of development. And finally, just to kind of point out some high-level key changes between this draft and the previous draft that came out in November. One of the things that we heard was that we wanted to make sure that we were adequately reflecting the cost of a type of mitigation, and that the value and the cost were close to one another. So we did recalibrate the multimodal and TDM mitigation point values to make sure that cost and value was closer together. We defined a fee in lieu option for mitigation to provide both some predictability and some flexibility when there might be a physical constraint to construct a particular physical infrastructure improvement. And then finally, the goal of the CTR, or one goal of the CTR, is to make sure that we're being appropriate in applying context to the way we look at and evaluate transportation impacts. And so we included a new step or a new step in the scoping process. And this is a technical step where the area of influence is determined And there's some flexibility there as part of that step to define a context-based area of influence, recognizing that the study area that you want to do for an activity center may be different from something that's located in a different type of context. So again, that's a technical step to help determine the area of influence. And those are key changes between the two drafts. And I think, Julian, this is back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Before we get into questions and answers with our panel, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about next steps and other opportunities to engage. So today, this is our second virtual community meeting. It's and as you know, we're also in the middle of our public comment period, and that is following alongside the UDO, and that's going to go through June 30th. There's opportunities to comment both on the UDO and on the Streets Manual and Streets Map online through this public engagement period. We also are providing an opportunity for virtual office hours. And what that is just an opportunity for you to sit down either virtually or in person or on the phone with any one of our panel members or maybe anyone else in our department that would maybe be helpful to your specific questions. And we're going to be holding those as or by request. And that can go beyond June 30th as well, into July as well. And if you want to request that time, just email charlottedot@charlottenc.gov. That link is there on the slide. And we can go ahead and get that scheduled. A little more information about submitting comments online. So if you wanted to comment on the interactive streets map, you would go again to that strategic mobility plan page that I referenced earlier. Again, just as a reminder, the strategic mobility plan, that's our long range vision policy document, was actually adopted by council last night. And we're hosting some of our other planning efforts on that page alongside the SMP. So go to that SMP page, you will see links for both the streets map and the streets manual document. And we also have a link here if you want to go directly to the streets manual public input page. That's a separate page set up to receive comments directly on that document. So you can click on that as well, and that will take you directly there. City Council is going to be holding public comment on July 11th. So if you'd like to provide any comments directly to council, you would have an opportunity to do that on July 11th. And then we're hoping that the streets manual and the streets map will be adopted by council in August alongside the UDO on August 22nd. So with that, we're going to start going through some questions. We've had a few come in. Hold on. Okay, so start with one. How does the streets manual and streets map help improve safety in Charlotte? So I'll open that up to our panel. One of you want to jump in on that, and then we can potentially go around as well if more than one of you wants to jump in.
Sure. Thanks, Julian. That's a great question. I'll take a first stab at it. So I think one thing I wanted to reiterate is that the Streets Manual kind of incorporates and combines a lot of previously adopted plans and policies, including most recently the SMP. And a lot of that is focused on providing transportation choices for different modes and different ways of getting around town, but also about doing that safely. So that's where you see things like the bicycle and pedestrian facilities incorporated into each cross section, space for safe crossings, and again, vehicular operation improvements as well. So I'd say the streets map is a critical tool that we're using to provide improved safety and different ways of getting around town, both in how land development projects will incrementally improve the street network and their frontages, but also as a guiding and starting point for public investment for capital projects to improve the streets as well.
This is Ed McKinney. I would just add to that, as Tracy was just describing the comprehensive transportation review guidelines, as you saw, there's a real important emphasis around multimodal and pedestrian investment. In many cases, pedestrian crossings and other improvements we make are really designed to help shape and make sure that our streets are safe and comfortable, particularly as development occurs. So as David described, we have a long-range vision ultimately for how our streets want to develop and be invested in, but we can do lots of things incrementally through those guidelines as development occurs partnering with developers to get private investment coupled with our public investment to, in a more immediate way, improve safety and comfort along our streets.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Ed. I have another question that came in that's kind of maybe somewhat related. So how do the different street types on the streets map influence the type of development occurring along the street?
That's a great question. And I would say the street types are sort of a spectrum or gradient ranging from parkways to boulevards, avenues, and main streets. And each one of those combined with the street type, combined with the zoning district and the UDO, is going to provide dimensional standards such as setback, design details like building articulation, build to zones, and frontage types as well. So I'd say the street type combined with the zoning districts and the UDO really play a critical role in, I guess, the form and function of the development and how it relates to the street. Whereas the actual building type and land use is going to be more specifically tied to the zoning district.
Right, and just to add to that, this is Tracy, just to add to that, the way the UDO works with the streets map information, as David has pointed out, there's a lot of different types of building dimensions and standards that apply to what street you're on. So for example, at the most pedestrian oriented end of the spectrum of our street classifications is a main street. And so when you look in the UDO, for example, at what type of development and what the building form looks like and what the various standards are for the main street, they're going to be different from what you're going to find for a multi-lane boulevard in a more suburban type of location. So there's a direct connection between how the building and where the building is placed and how it's placed and how it's designed to that street classification.
Great, thank you. Another question about streets and how they function. What measures are being taken for learning how to share the streets? As a biker or walker, I am nervous to go out on my own with the drivers going top speeds.
So I think from a facility standpoint, kind of how I previously mentioned that the big role of the streets map is providing that street cross section and what components. So getting the safe space and kind of our updated standards, such as buffered bike lane or shared use path, kind of above and beyond the standard bike lane we used to see. So that's about providing the correct space and an appropriately designed dimension. So each mode essentially has their safe space. But I would say some of our related policy documents, like the SMP and Vision Zero, are really where things about enforcement, encouragement, and education are. So the streets map and streets manual are primarily focused on the regulatory environment and how land development improves our streets and a starting point for our capital investment. But we still have other plans and policies and programmatic efforts that are kind of separate from this piece. I think the SMP that was adopted last night speaks to that. And we have things like the Vision Zero action plan and stuff as well that really dive into that stuff and working with our partners throughout the region as well.
And I don't know if Tracy was going to jump in, but I just wanted to add, I think we recognize that the physical investment we make in bicycle facilities is only one part of this. We understand that there's a significant educational, as David said, educational and kind of promotion efforts that need to be made. We have, the city council is committed to our bicycle program. And so, as David mentioned, there's dollars in that go to the physical improvements, but also support things like events and educational and awareness programs that we do to help sort of shift the culture of how we move and support specifically bicycle movement in our city. We have, and this is a long established bicycle advisory committee through the city council. That committee is made up of citizens who are, intended to promote and advance bicycle movement and promotion throughout our city. And that group essentially helps push and advocate for the events and programs and physical investment that needs to be made. So again, my point there is we understand that the map, the technical things, the public investment we make in facilities is only one part of this. And certainly a major cultural shift and the promotion of that is another important part. And through our programs, we're certainly committed to help support that.
Thanks for that explanation and discussing kind of that difference between the education programmatic piece and the physical infrastructure. I did have a question that was tied more so to the physical infrastructure piece. Would any of you be willing to give a little more detail on the different types of bike facilities that we're proposing on the streets map?
Sure, that's a great question. And again, I think I pointed that our previously adopted plans and policies that draw on public engagement and industry best practices really inform all the modal components within the streets map. Specifically to bikes, we have a Charlotte Bikes bicycle plan that was adopted in 2017. And that outlines a palette or toolbox of different bicycle facility types based on the street context and the land use context as well. So it ranges from a shared street, so a quiet local neighborhood street that provides good connections. The next step up is a standard bike lane. So that's kind of a striped 5-foot dimension bike lane. Kind of our next evolution of standard, I would say, is what we call a buffered or separated bike lane. So that provides 3 additional feet to the 5 feet standard bike lane. And that 3 feet gives us flexibility for just additional buffer space, or in the appropriate context, perhaps vertical separation and physical elements to make that separated bike lane and increase the comfort and perception of safety as well. And then we also have shared use paths, which are behind the curb facilities when used in the appropriate context. That's a 12-foot dimension that is shared for bicycles and pedestrians and other users. And in limited cases, such as uptown and very specific urban projects, you will see things like 2-way cycle tracks. But again, that's kind of like the palette and range of bicycle facilities, and they've been applied based on the characteristics of the street, but also the anticipated future land use change as well. So more information about that can be found both in the streets manual that provides the technical dimensional standards of those palettes, but the policy foundation is reiterated from the Charlotte Bikes bicycle plan.
And I think just to kind of add to that, there's been a lot of work put into obviously developing the streets map and the bike related, the bike facility recommendations that are part of that. But what's really good about the way the streets map works with and the streets manual works with the UDO is that the UDO recognizes and references specifically those cross sections that are shown in the streets map, so that as development occurs, we're making sure that we're getting, we're preserving to get that space to provide those bike facilities, and that we're also, doing that in a context-based way. And that finally, that the buildings are going to be put in the right place so that, as we incrementally build out the city and build out the network, we're getting the right type of facility and the right type of location. And we've got the space to do that.
Great. Got another question coming in about CTR. So bear with me, it's a little bit of a long one. I'm just going to read through it. What strategies are going to be implemented to evaluate the ongoing efficiency of these mitigation measures? We are concerned that many of the programmatic strategies could be quickly reversed by building owners or managers, which would result in no long-term benefits to tenants and people in the surrounding community.
Do you want me, Tracy? You can jump in, but maybe I'll start. One thing I'll say, particularly around, as Tracy described, the kind of major shift we're making in these guidelines, TDM as part of that shift is a very new thing for us, and certainly a very new thing in Charlotte. And so as the question recognizes, one of the challenges to that is, the long-term monitoring and sort of making sure that projects are actually doing, particularly the programmatic things, that they're actually doing those things in the long term. What I would describe as what we're doing in these guidelines is setting the framework for that. We've put together a pretty specific menu. We have some specific triggers. So when the scale of a project, and as Tracy mentioned, when it's in the right context, we're really making sure that we put on the table and require initially those programmatic things. We recognize that one of the next steps we will need to do, particularly as we learn through this process, there will be some next steps that we will evolve to that will be a little bit more specific about how we ensure projects over the long term actually stay committed to those elements. To be honest, what we recognize is the first step here is to put that conversation on the table, allow us through that process to learn more about what works, what makes sense, what's the most effective thing that we can do with development to really refine and tailor our approach long term and help us think through again how we would ensure that we're enforcing and making sure those programmatic things sort of live on in the long term. We are certainly going to track it initially. We'll have contacts for all those development projects. We'll begin to set a kind of a system and a way for us to kind of go back, ensure and test whether these things are still in place, learn from what the experiences are, and then again, help us refine and kind of revise this program as we move forward.
Thanks, Ed, for that. And that was actually the last question that we've had come in. So if you have any last burning questions, now's the time to go ahead and put those in the chat. Otherwise, Hannah, would you mind putting the last slide back up with that email address? And I'll just remind everyone that we have an opportunity if you have any other questions, really about anything, but specifically about the Streets Manual. We're setting up these virtual office hours, and this email, if you email us here, we can definitely get something scheduled to chat more in depth or meet in person and talk in more detail about any of these issues. So feel free to take advantage of that. We'd love to meet more with any of you, and just want to say thank you so much for spending the time today, engaging with us, engaging in this process. We're excited about the changes that we're making and the improvements we're making and trying to move towards a more multimodal city. So we thank you for your engagement.